Every night after his family went to sleep, Paul McCartney would disappear into his basement with a bottle of wine and a key that only Linda knew existed. Behind a hidden door in their Sussex farmhouse, Paul had built something no one could imagine: a complete recording studio where he spent 3 years secretly re-recording every Beatles song exactly the way he thought they should have been. For 3 years, from 1977 to 1980, Paul descended into his underground sanctuary and became the Beatles again, playing every instrument, singing every harmony, creating the versions of their songs that lived in his head but had never made it onto vinyl. What he created was so personal, so revelatory, that when the tapes were discovered 30 years later, they would rewrite the history of the world's greatest band. But these weren't just cover versions or nostalgic retreats into the past. These were Paul's confessions, his corrections, his attempts to fix what he saw as the flaws in their original recordings. And hidden among the familiar songs was something even more shocking: completely new Beatles songs that Paul had written alone, performed by all four members of a band that no longer existed. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's greatest mysteries, you need to hear this. Because sometimes the most important music is created in secret, and sometimes the most honest versions of ourselves emerge only when we're completely alone. Sussex, England. Waterfall Farm, September 1977, 11:47 p.m. Paul stood at the top of the basement stairs, listening to make sure Linda and the children were asleep. The house was quiet except for the old floorboards creaking in the wind. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. Perfect. He had at least 6 hours before anyone would wake up. Paul opened the basement door and descended into what looked like a normal storage area: boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, forgotten belongings from their London days. But Paul walked to the far corner and pressed against what appeared to be a solid wall. A hidden door swung open, revealing a fully equipped recording studio that had taken him 8 months and £60,000 to build in complete secrecy. The studio was small but professional: a 4-track mixing board, high-quality microphones, guitar amplifiers, a full drum kit, and a Rickenbacker bass identical to the one he'd played on every Beatles record. On the walls hung photos of the Beatles during their happiest recording sessions: Hamburg, the Cavern Club. Early days at Abbey Road, when they were just 4 friends making music they loved. Paul had told Linda it was his thinking room, a place to work on new Wings material. She was the only person who knew the room existed, and even she didn't know what Paul really did down there every night. What Paul did was become the Beatles again. The first recording. October 15th, 1977, 12:30 a.m. Paul sat at his bass guitar and played the opening notes of "Come Together." But this wasn't the version the world knew. This was slower, heavier, more ominous. This was the version Paul had heard in his head when John first played him the song, before they'd sped it up for the album. Paul had spent weeks setting up the recording equipment, learning to operate it alone. Tonight was his first attempt at what he was calling the private sessions. His chance to record Beatles songs the way they should have been, without compromise, without outside pressure, without anyone else's input. He started with bass, laying down a foundation that was deeper and more menacing than the original. Then he switched to drums, playing Ringo's parts, but with subtle changes that made the rhythm more complex. Guitar came next. Both John's rhythm parts and George's lead, played separately and layered to create textures that had never existed in the original recordings. Finally, vocals. Paul closed his eyes and became John Lennon, singing "Come Together" with a growl that was more dangerous, more sexual, more mysterious than John's original performance. Then he overdubbed his own harmonies, creating a conversation between voices that had never had the chance to develop in the original sessions. When Paul played back the final mix, he was stunned. It was still "Come Together," recognizably the same song, but it was also something entirely new. It was the song as it had existed in pure potential, before recording schedules and producer opinions and band politics had shaped it into its final form. Paul sat in his basement studio until 6 a.m., listening to his version over and over, understanding for the first time in years why he had fallen in love with making music in the first place. Linda's Discovery, November 1977. Linda knew something was happening in the basement. Paul was disappearing every night, returning to bed just before dawn, with a strange energy she hadn't seen since the early Beatles days. He was writing constantly, humming melodies she didn't recognize, asking her odd questions about harmonies and arrangements. One night, Linda followed him downstairs. She watched through the crack in the hidden door. As Paul played all four parts of Yesterday simultaneously, bass, strings, drums that hadn't existed in the original, and vocals that were heartbreakingly beautiful. This version of Yesterday wasn't just a song. It was a conversation Paul was having with his younger self, a meditation on everything he had gained and lost since writing it. When Paul finished, Linda quietly went back upstairs. She never mentioned what she'd seen, but she started staying awake later, listening to the muffled sounds of her husband rebuilding his musical past, one song at a time. The Revelation Songs, March 1978. 6 months into the project, Paul realized he wasn't just re-recording old Beatles songs. He was writing new ones, songs that sounded like they could have been on Abbey Road or Revolver, but had never existed. Songs that came from the part of his brain that only activated when he was channeling the collective consciousness of the Beatles. The first new song was called "Another Day in Paradise," not to be confused with his later Wings song of a similar name. This was a John Lennon-style ballad about the moments between sleeping and waking when you forget, just for a second, that everything has changed. Paul sang it in John's voice, harmonized with his own, and created something that felt like a message from an alternate timeline. Then came Mary Had a Little Lamb, Redux, a complete reimagining of his Silly Wings song as a psychedelic masterpiece that could have fit on Sgt. Pepper's. Paul took his throwaway children's song and turned it into a meditation on innocence and loss, complete with backwards guitars and orchestral arrangements. But the most shocking song was Jude's Lament, a response to Hey Jude, written from the perspective of someone who had taken the advice to take a sad song and make it better, and discovered that sometimes better is just a different kind of sadness. The Beatles Sessions, July 1978, December 1979. By the summer of 1978, Paul was spending 4 to 6 hours every night in his secret studio. He had re-recorded 30 Beatles songs and written 12 new ones. But he'd also started doing something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew about the band's bitter breakup. He was having conversations with John, George, and Ringo. Paul would record John's parts first, channeling not just his voice and guitar playing, but his personality, his humor, his way of approaching music. Then he would respond as himself, creating musical arguments and agreements that felt like the collaborations they'd had in their prime. Don't Let Me Down became a 20-minute epic, where Paul as John sang about betrayal and abandonment, and Paul as Paul responded with reassurances and apologies. Here Comes the Sun turned into a dialogue about hope and healing, with George's optimism balanced by Paul's more cautious worldview. Most remarkably, Paul learned to channel Ringo's drumming style so completely that when he played back the recordings, he could hear Ringo's humor and humanity in every fill and accent. The drums weren't just rhythm, they were commentary, the voice of the member who had always been the band's emotional center. The discovery, December 1979. Paul had been planning to record for one more year to complete what he thought of as the Beatles' completed works. But on December 8, 1979, exactly 1 year before John would die, something happened that changed everything. Paul was working on a new arrangement of Let It Be when he heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Linda appeared in the doorway of the studio, holding a cup of tea and looking around in amazement. "My God, Paul, what is all this?" Paul stopped playing and looked around his secret world as if seeing it for the first time. The walls covered with Beatles photos, the instruments that were exact replicas of their original equipment, the dozens of tape reels labeled with song titles that told the story of their musical partnership. "I've been fixing things," Paul said quietly. "All the songs we never got quite right. All the harmonies we never had time to perfect. All the conversations we never finished." Linda sat down beside him at the mixing board. "How long have you been doing this?" 2 years. Every night." "Linda, I've re-recorded almost everything we ever did. And I've written new songs that sound like..." Paul's voice broke slightly. "They sound like we never broke up. They sound like we kept growing together instead of growing apart." Linda picked up one of the tape reels. "Can I hear something?" Paul put on All You Need Is Love, the complete version. A 15-minute arrangement that included musical quotes from every other Beatles song, creating a musical autobiography of the band's entire career. Linda listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. "Paul, this is incredible. This is what the Beatles would sound like if they'd had unlimited time and no pressure and perfect understanding of each other's musical minds." "Exactly," Paul said. "This is what we could have been if we hadn't let everything else get in the way." The decision, January 1980. Paul faced a dilemma. He had created something musically remarkable, 3 years of work that represented both the ultimate Beatles album and a completely new form of musical autobiography. But he had also created something that felt too personal to share. These recordings weren't just music. They were therapy. They were Paul's way of processing the guilt, regret, and loss that had haunted him since the band's breakup. They were his attempt to have the musical conversations he'd never been able to have with John, George, and Ringo in person. Linda argued that the tapes should be released. "This is some of the most beautiful music you've ever created," she told him. "And it's a love letter to your friendship with the other three. How could that be wrong?" But Paul wasn't sure the world was ready for music that essentially rewrote Beatles history. And he wasn't sure John, George, and Ringo would understand what he'd been trying to do. In the end, Paul made a decision that would haunt him for decades. He sealed the tapes in a vault and told Linda they would never be released during his lifetime. "Maybe someday," he said, "when we're all gone and people can listen to them without all the baggage of our personal relationships, maybe then someone will understand what I was trying to say." The end of the sessions, December 8th, 1980. Paul's last recording session took place on the third anniversary of the project, December 8th, 1980. He had planned to record one final song, a new composition called "The End of Everything," that would serve as a conclusion to his 3-year musical journey. But as Paul sat in his studio that night, he couldn't bring himself to sing. Something felt wrong. The creative energy that had sustained him for 3 years felt suddenly hollow. At 11:45 p.m. London time, 6:45 p.m. in New York, Paul turned off his recording equipment and went upstairs to bed, leaving "The End of Everything" unrecorded. 5 hours later, John Lennon was shot and killed outside the Dakota Building. Paul never returned to the basement studio. The hidden door was sealed, and Paul told Linda he never wanted to speak about the recordings again. 30 years later, 2007. When Linda died in 1998, she left detailed instructions about Paul's secret recordings. The tapes were to remain sealed until 30 years after they were recorded, 2010 at the earliest, and only then could Paul decide what to do with them. In 2007, Paul's estate managers were cataloging his archives when they discovered Linda's instructions and the sealed basement studio. Paul, now 65, stood in the room for the first time in 27 years, looking at the dust-covered equipment and the carefully labeled tape reels. "I'd forgotten how much work I did down here," he told his assistant. "I'd forgotten how hopeful it all was." Paul spent 3 days listening to the complete recordings, nearly 40 hours of music that represented the most intensive creative period of his solo career. When he finished, he was crying. "It's like listening to ghosts," he said. "Happy ghosts, but ghosts nonetheless." The Decision Redux, 2010. On the 30th anniversary of John's death, Paul made a different decision. He selected 12 of the most complete recordings and had them professionally mastered. He didn't release them commercially, but he did share them with Ringo, with George's widow Olivia, and with Yoko. Ringo called him after listening. "Paul, this is what we sounded like in your head. This is how you heard us when we were making music together. It's beautiful, man. It's really beautiful." Olivia Harrison wrote him a letter. "George would have loved these arrangements. You captured something about his guitar playing that even he might not have recognized about himself." Yoko was quiet for a long time before responding. Finally, she said, "John would have been honored that you spent so much time trying to understand his musical voice. He would have been honored, and he would have been moved." Legacy The Basement recordings remain unreleased, though rumors of their existence have circulated among Beatles scholars for years. Paul has played selections for close friends and family, but he maintains that they are too personal for public consumption. "Those recordings represent 3 years of conversations with my best friends," Paul explained in a rare interview about the project. "Conversations we never got to have in real life, but conversations that felt completely real to me while I was making them. Some conversations are too private to share, even when they're set to music." The hidden studio still exists, preserved exactly as Paul left it in 1980. Sometimes late at night, Paul will go down there and sit at the piano, playing fragments of songs that exist nowhere else in the world. Songs that sound like the Beatles, but songs that only one Beatle has ever heard. Because sometimes the most important music is the music we make for ourselves. Sometimes the most meaningful performances have an audience of one. And sometimes the best way to honor a friendship is to keep its most beautiful moments private, preserved in a secret room where four voices can still harmonize perfectly, even decades after three of them have gone silent.